Okay, you guys, yesterday you practiced order of operations with integers, and today you are going to practice order of operations with rational numbers. Okay, so I want you to go ahead and grab the worksheet that I just passed out to you. If you're online, you can print the worksheet from the module underneath the order of operations assignment. Okay, please follow along. As I am doing these problems, I want you to also be doing them on your own paper. I'm going to go through 6 of them, and then you guys are going to have 6 that I'm going to have you try on your own. Okay, so number 1 says evaluate. We have 1 2/3 plus 1/2 times by 16 minus 24 minus 2/3. Okay, so remember in math, anytime you have a number right next to a parenthesis, that is implied multiplication. Yesterday, we reviewed the order of operations. So remember, you always do parentheses first, then you take care of any exponents, then you do all multiplications and divisions working left to right, whatever comes first in your problem. Then you do all additions and subtractions, again, working left to right. Remember, the key thing is that multiplication does not always come before division, and addition does not always come before subtraction. You do whatever is in the problem first. Okay, now, if we look at number 1, we don't have any exponents, but we do have a parenthesis, okay? And inside our parenthesis, we have a 16 subtract 24. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and write this bigger over here to the side. I think you should have enough space on your paper, but I need a little bit more room here on my screen. Okay, so I'm going to change this subtraction to addition by doing keep, change, change. So a 16 plus a negative 24. Is going to be a negative 8. Okay, now this negative 8 is in the parenthesis right next to the 1/2. Okay, so I have 1 2/3 plus 1/2 times by negative 8, and then I have a subtract 2/3. So after I have taken care of the parenthesis, we don't have any exponents. The next thing that we are going to do is all multiplications and divisions. Okay, so we're going to do 1/2 times by negative 8. So 1/2 times by negative 8, to make 8 a fraction, I just put it over 1. And then remember, to multiply fractions, you do top times top. So 1 times negative 8 is negative 8, over bottom times bottom. 2 times 1 is 2. Negative 8 divided by 2 is a negative 4. So now we have 1 2/3 minus 4 minus 2/3. And this was a negative 4. I'm just going to go ahead and change this subtraction to adding a negative and this subtraction to adding a negative. Okay. Now we are ready to continue with this problem. So we're just going to start on the left and we're going to work right. So 1 2/3 plus a negative 4. 1 2/3 plus a negative 4. Okay, that's where we're at. And I'm going to erase some space up above. So let's just move our problem to the top here. So I've got 1 2/3 plus a negative 4 plus a negative 2/3. Okay, so I'm going to make this is the part we're doing right now. So I'm going to change this mixed number to an improper fraction. So that's going to give me 5/3 plus a negative 4. I'm going to put this negative 4 over 1, and then I'm going to find a common denominator. Which leaves me with 5/3 plus negative 12 thirds, and then remember we also have our negative 2 thirds. So now that we have a common denominator, we know our denominator is going to be a 3. Now we can just combine our top integers. So we have a 5, we have a negative 12, and we have a negative 2. So 5 and a negative 12 together would be a negative 7, and a negative 7 and a negative 2 would be a negative 9. And then in the end, negative 9 divided by 3 is a negative 3. Whew. Okay, let's go ahead and look at number 2. Okay, on number 2, we have a negative 10 right next to a parenthesis. Inside the parenthesis, we have a 2.3 subtract 1.7. And then we have a subtract 0.5. And then right next to the 0.5, we have a negative 14. Okay, so that means the 0.5 is going to get multiplied by the negative 14. Okay, so let's follow order of operations, which say parentheses first, then exponents, then multiplications, divisions, then additions, subtractions. So inside our parentheses, 2.3 subtract 1.7. Okay, we change this subtraction to addition. 2.3 plus a negative 1.7, so we're going to subtract those two, which would give us 0.6. So now we have negative 10 times by 0.6, and then we have a subtract 0.5 times by negative 14. So now at this point, we need to do both of our multiplications before we do our additions or subtractions. I want you to realize that this subtraction right here, we can change to adding a negative. Okay? So, negative 10 times 6 is negative 60 plus negative 0.5 times 14 would be 7.0 positive. Now we can just add. A negative 60 plus 7 would be a negative 53. Final answer. Okay, let's go ahead and look at number 3. Okay, on number 3, inside one parenthesis, we have a 0.8 times by a 1/2 times by 10, and then we are subtracting a 5/6 times by 6/5. Okay, let's just go ahead and start with this parenthesis. Remember, you can multiply in any order, and since all three of these numbers are being multiplied together, we can multiply in any order that we want. I'm going to start with just multiplying the 0.8 times 1/2. I'm going to change the 0.8 to a fraction of 8/10. Okay, and 8/10 times by 1/2 is 8/20. Now we need to times that by 10. The 10 becomes a fraction by putting it over 1. And then top times top, 8 times 10 is 80. Bottom times bottom, 20 times 1 is 20. And 80 divided by 20 is a 4. Okay, so that was this parenthesis. Now let's go ahead and do the other parenthesis. 5/6 times by 6/5. Well, top times top over bottom times bottom. 5 times 6 is 30. 6 times 5 is 30. And 30 divided by 30 is a 1. So now we have 4 minus 1, or we could say 4 plus a negative 1. Either way, this final answer would be 3. Okay, let's look at number 4. Okay, now as we do number 4, I want you to start looking at this and deciding what operation you would do first. So we have a 1/3 times by negative 15. We're adding that to a 1/4 times by negative 12 plus 16. Okay? So the operation that we would do first would be the parentheses. So let's go ahead and do this first. Negative 12 plus 16. If you owe 12 and you have 16, that's going to be 4. So now we have 1/4 times by 4. To make that a fraction, we would put it over 1. Okay? We have an addition, and then we have 1/3 times by negative 15. So we are going to do this multiplication and this multiplication before we do the addition. So here we go. 1 times negative 15 is negative 15. 3 times 1 is 3. Negative 15 divided by 3 is negative 5. Plus 1 times 4 is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And a negative 5 and a positive 1 would give us a negative 4. Okay, let's go ahead and do the next one. Now remember, anytime you are watching a video and you feel like I'm going too fast, you can always pause the video. You can also rewind it. You can rewatch it. That's one of the nice things about having a video lesson. Okay, now on this one we have negative 3/2, and it is being multiplied by negative 5.75 plus a 2/3 plus a 5 3/4. Okay, so on this one, we want to change all of these to be fractions, and then we're just going to add the fractions. Okay, so negative 5.75 as a fraction, we know we would have negative 5 3/4, because 0.75 as a fraction is just 3/4. Okay, then we have our 2/3, and then we have our 5 3/4. Now remember that when we are doing adding, we can change the order that we add things in, and it doesn't actually change the expression. So if I rearrange this and I put the negative 5 3/4 together and the positive 5 3/4 together and add those first, that's going to make this a little bit easier for us. So a negative 5 3/4 and a positive 5 3/4, that's just going to cancel each other out, and it will give us a 0, and then a 0 plus 2/3 is 2/3. Okay, so now we have a negative 3/2 times by 2/3. That is going to be a negative 6/6, and a negative 6 divided by a positive 6 is a negative 1. Okay, let's go ahead and do the last one, and then I am going to give you guys some to practice on your own. Okay, so we have negative 2 times by 1 1/2. Then we have a subtract 3/4. And then we have an addition sign. And then we have 0.4 times by 0.25. Okay, let's go ahead and do this parenthesis first. 1 1/2 subtract 3/4. So we can change this to adding a negative. In order to do this, 1 1/2 combined with negative 3/4, I'm going to change the 1 1/2 to an improper fraction, which would be 3/2 plus negative 3/4. Then I'm going to find a common denominator, which would be 4. I have to times this by 2, this by 2, that gives me 6. This by 1 and this by 1, which gives me negative 3. And a 6/4 and a negative 3/4 would be a 3/4. Okay, that's what ends up being in our parenthesis. And we now have to multiply that by a negative 2, which we'll put that over 1. So negative 2 times 3 is negative 6. 1 times 4 is 4. So negative 6/4. Okay, negative 6/4 simplifies. 2 goes into negative 6, negative 3 times. 2 goes into 4 twice. Whew, negative 3/2. Okay, so now we have a negative 3/2. And we need to add that to these two guys multiplied together. So when we multiply a 0.25 times by a 0.4, remember when you multiply decimals, you don't have to line up the decimals. The only thing you have to remember is if there are 3 numbers to the right of the decimal in your problem, there has to be 3 numbers to the right of the decimal in your answer. Okay? Now, in order to add a -3/2 with a 0.1, we can either change them both to fractions or we can change them both to decimals. I'm going to change them both to fractions because 0.1 as a fraction is just 1/10. That's pretty easy. So now we find a common denominator. We have to times this one by 5, this one by 5, so that gives me -15/10 plus 1/10, which is -14/10. Almost the final answer, but not quite. We still need to simplify this. 2 goes into 14 7 times, 2 goes into 10 5 times, so -7/5. Okay, you guys, you did it. Those problems were kind of tricky, okay? But now you are ready to try some problems on your own. On the back side of the worksheet that I just did with you, okay, so this was the front side. On the back side of that, it says order of operations with mixed rational numbers, okay? So when we look at number 1, you can see that it says 6 times by 1/4 minus 1.25 plus -2/5 plus 8.78. So on these ones, you're going to have to change both to fractions or both to decimals to be able to do that addition, okay? I want you to do these 2 questions at a time. So you're going to do 2 questions, then you're going to come back, I'm going to check it off with you, and then you're going to do 2 more questions. Then you're going to come back, I'm going to check it off with you, and then you're going to do 2 more questions, okay? So with that said, let's go ahead and get started on your practice.